Hi, everyone. As always, I am thrilled to be here with you for another episode of the podcast. It's September, my birthday month, summer is winding down, and we're all getting back into routines over here where I live. And if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope you've had an amazing summer. And for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, I'm so jealous that you're going into your warm months right now. Anyways, I have been dying to bring you this long awaited and deeply insightful conversation with a thought provoking guest, Ruby Warrington, whose work is changing the way we perceive motherhood, choices, and societal norms. Ruby is an author and the visionary behind the term sober curious, a movement that has sparked a global reconsideration of our relationship with alcohol. Her books, Material Girl, Mystical World, and The Sober Curious Reset, have inspired countless individuals to explore their inner worlds, challenge the status quo, and reimagine their lives. Today, we delve into another aspect of the human experience as Ruby shares insights from her latest book, Women Without Kids. This candid exploration shatters stereotypes and brings to light the intricacies of choosing a child-free path. In this book, Ruby navigates topics ranging from societal pressures to generational patterns, all while fostering a space for dialogue and growth. In our conversation, we uncover the emotional journey of deciding not to have children, confronting cultural expectations, and embracing personal empowerment around this subject. Ruby delves into her own experiences, reflecting on societal narratives and internal struggles that resonate deeply with so many, myself included. Her courage to question norms and her dedication to making the conversation around childlessness mainstream make her a true trailblazer. From the impact of pronatalism on our beliefs to the complexities of family dynamics, we explore the various dimensions of this journey. We touch on regret, generativity, and the nuances of breaking free from expectations. Ruby's insights offer solace to those who've questioned the norm and a window into a life that's been intentionally and beautifully curated. So, whether you're a woman navigating the labyrinth of societal expectations or simply curious about the experiences of women without kids, this episode promises to inspire and provoke thought. Ruby's authenticity and wisdom will undoubtedly leave you reflecting on your own motherhood journey. As always, thank you so much for being here and supporting the podcast. If you want to share your own thoughts about this topic, you can find us on Instagram at Nicole M. Jardim and Ruby Warrington. You can also leave a comment for us on YouTube where you'll find the full video episode and all previous episodes on video too. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hi, Ruby. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Nicole, thanks for having me.
I have been looking forward to this conversation for weeks and weeks, and I am just so thrilled to finally be digging into this topic with you because, as I was saying before we started recording, it is near and dear to my heart. I'm one of those women who sat pretty firmly on the fence about having children for many years, like the entirety of my 30s. And for me, it has never really been a hell yes. So yeah, personally, it just really needed to be. And ultimately, I kind of made a decision in my indecision. And now at 43, I don't have kids. But I spent a really long time feeling like there was something wrong with me. And maybe, I was just sort of this non-maternal selfish bitch who couldn't get her shit together to be a grown-up and have children like all the other grown-ups around me. And I know you speak about this pretty extensively throughout your book. But can you talk about this internal struggle? Because I know I'm not alone with these whirlwind thoughts.
Well, you're definitely not. I mean, you're speaking my own story almost back to me, I just never really had a strong maternal instinct. Like I didn't feel a pull to motherhood the same way that I felt a pull towards studying going into journalism for a career, or a pull towards certain relationships, or a pull towards moving to New York. These are all things that I really wanted for my life as soon as they presented to me. Motherhood had obviously been presented to me from girlhood, and it was never something that just lit me up like in that way, And so I think perhaps because I came from a family where there was zero pressure from either of my parents to become a parent or to follow in their footsteps. It was never implied to me by either of my parents that that would be something they expected of me, that should be my path. They separated and lived. They were together, like still married, but lived apart from when I was 1 year old. So I never really even had a model of kind of like a traditional nuclear family setup. My parents were both quite estranged from their families of origin. So it just wasn't front and center that like family is what we do. And I think not having that modeled to me, that this is what we do, like this is how you form a family, this is what your life should be about, really gave me permission to accept my no quite early on. And yet, because the cultural pressure is so intense, and because the cultural expectation in the culture at large is that women are destined to become mothers, will become mothers, that's how we will find our fulfillment. And because at a certain age, late 20s, early 30s, all of my friends started to start talking about having children and then started to have children, of course, I questioned whether this was something I wanted, whether this was something I should want, whether this was something I should be doing, even though my internal, my intuition around it was that, no, this is not for me. I questioned that deeply throughout my 20s. It kind of kicked in. I got married at 27, which was quite young, actually, at the time. I was the first in my friend group to get married, funnily enough. But then throughout my 30s, the volume on that just got louder and louder and louder. And I spent so many years trying to talk myself into wanting to be a mother. And you said something which I think I could really relate to as well, which was, it was never a hell yes. And it had to be a hell yes. I think as much as I got pretty close a few times to talking myself into, I'll love it when I do it, I should just go for it and then I'll figure it out. But there was always something there was always a doubt. There were always a seed of doubt. And I'm so grateful that I actually listened to that, because this is not something that should be entered into lightly. And I think so many people go into parenthood without really considering if it's what they truly want, without really considering the implications of how it's going to impact on their other dreams, aspirations, how it's going to impact on their freedom, their autonomy, etc., etc. And I think this is probably one of the things that feeds into a lot of feelings of disillusionment, even postpartum depression, after someone's had a child. And we can maybe get into that all a bit deeper as we go on the conversation. But yeah, I think I was 43 when I decided to write this book, because I'd reached a phase in my life, an age and a level of maturity and a level of self-awareness, I suppose, where I was ready to really unpack why I'd never wanted to be a mother and why it was expected of me to be a mother. And so that was, the impetus for writing the book, really.
Okay. I mean, there's 12,000 things to unpack here that you've just said. You also have now just literally reflected my life back to me. And there was also no pressure as when I was younger for me to have kids, or my sister. She doesn't either. She's just turned 42. And she's been much more firm in her decision than I have. I've definitely been wishy-washier, but she, and very influenced by these external factors like you're describing as well. Like your friends are having kids and you're with an absolute love of your life. And, and I've also almost talked myself into it. And I also pursued journalism. That's so funny. And TV production and film and all this. And so, it's just an interesting timeline, but I think that there's just so many things that go into this. Like, I know that you talked about in the intro that you wanted to, maybe it was a joke, I'm not sure. You were going to call the book Selfish Cunt. And I just think it's so great. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase here, but I know you talked about, if a woman chooses not have kids, right, that she's delusional, or she's going to surely regret it. Or she's just cold-hearted. She's narcissistic. She's obsessed with other things. Can you elaborate on this portrayal of women in our society who choose not to have children as being selfish? Because I do feel, while I feel that has shifted quite dramatically in the past decade or two, with more and more women choosing a child-free life, I do still feel like this is very much a prevailing narrative. And, I feel like it's so good for us to be talking about this, because this is actually not the case at all. And we do deeply think about this, as is evidenced by what you just said.
So I think this selfish tag is definite. Anyone who is a woman without kids, and particularly if it's if you're childless by choice, will have probably, whether not directly to your face, absorbed from the culture that it's a selfish decision not to have children. So we can definitely get into that. I do think that's shifting, but I think it's only really in the past 5 years or so that I've started to see a shift there. But I think actually, I didn't iterate this in the book, but it's come up for me now as we're talking. I think it's something to do with the Me Too movement, really shone a light on how, no, it is not selfish for women to have bodily and physical autonomy, particularly when it comes to matters pertaining to our sexuality. And our reproductive capacity is intimately and intricately linked to our sexuality and to female sexuality. And so I think shifting conversations around that has started to trickle into this idea that it's selfish to do what I want with my body, and specifically with my cunt. So that title, when I first considered writing on this subject, that title just like downloaded into my brain almost immediately, simultaneously with me deciding I wanted to write this book. And I was quite shocked in the moment that my own subconscious held this kind of opinion of my decision not to have children, you know? And then as I kind of reflected on it, like the double meaning of the title came through really strongly as well. Not only was it selfish, because I was reflecting on how fortunate and how grateful I felt to have been born and to have come of age at a time when I did get to choose not just whether I wanted to be a parent, but what I wanted to do with my life in general. There was a time not so long ago where the majority of women didn't have the choice about whether or not to bear children, and for child rearing to be front and center in their lives, right? And so I was really reflecting on how, as a woman without kids, how grateful I was to have been able to live my life exactly according to my own design. And then it was reflecting on that. What a selfish cunt just came from nowhere. I was kind of blindsided that, like I said, that my own subconscious kind of like had stored that quite violent language when I was just reflecting on how lucky I was and how fortunate and how grateful I was to have been able to live a life of my own choosing, you know? And so immediately I was just like, whoa, okay, that's messed up. If we as a society still believe that it is selfish for a woman to have autonomy over her life, her body, her sexuality, and to make choices about how she wants to live her life, that's messed up. There's still so much here to look at, you know? So yeah, and obviously, given the extent to which becoming a mother will take over and consume a woman's life, being selfish about our reproductive capacity, being selfish about what we do with our cunts, is integral to us having the option to continue to choose lives and design lives that really suit us and fit us and allow us to, you know, use our gifts in the ways that we feel the most inspired by. So it's really, it's an important prejudice, I think, to upend this idea that it's selfish not to have children. I think oftentimes, it's we view as well, and I think this is something that needs to be addressed. Mothers are expected to be selfless. And I think this is something else that causes a lot of mothers to not enjoy their mothering as much as they could. You know, the idea that to be a good mother is to be completely selfless and deny all of my own needs and always put my children's needs first. And by extension, often my partner's needs. I think that's also something that really needs to be addressed. You know, if it's selfish to be a woman without kids, that's not great. But if you have to be completely selfless in order to be a mother, that's not great either.
No. I mean, yeah, I know. It's so exhausting just thinking about it, because there doesn't ever really feel like there's much of a middle ground. And just thinking back to what you were talking about just now about really being the sort of first generation really to have autonomy over what we're doing with our bodies and our lives. I mean, I think back to my mom, who got married at 23, and that was the only thing she wanted to do. She had gone to school in London and gone to fashion school and had this big career potentially ahead of her, but chose to go back home to her family and marry my dad. And that was what she wanted to do. That was very much what was expected. And my grandmother got married at 19 because she was pregnant. And, you know, of course, like they had to make it seem like she wasn't pregnant prior to, you know, the marriage. So it was just the whole thing, and had 5 children, etc. So I think about that. And I just think about the fact that my grandmother too, extremely talented, just very gifted person in so many different areas, and was always wanting to do all of these things, and yet had these 5 kids. And I feel like this was a huge, I don't want to say burden, but, you know, it was very challenging for her to navigate. And it made a mess of her life to some degree, because she was just constantly juggling these 2 things at are very difficult to obviously juggle, especially back then. And so I agree with you. I just feel like we are so lucky to be born in the time that we're born in, to have the choices that we have. And yet we're still questioning.
Which, I mean, yes. I couldn't have predicted when I started working on this project. I mean, I started my research at the very end of 2019. I couldn't have predicted that 2 years later, Roe v. Wade would be overturned. And we would be back in a situation where for millions of women now, that choice has been taken away, you know? So yeah, if anything, that happening just before the 6 months or so before the book came out was another kind, it even gave me more sort of like passion, I suppose, to speak out on this subject and to start these conversations and to talk about how important it is for women to have the choice over whether we become mothers.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. You know, I always reflect on this. I think about that fact that my life feels so good. It feels very full, very satisfying. It's, you know, it's basically my dream life. You know, and I worked really, really hard to get here. I came to the US for college from a tiny island in the Caribbean. And sometimes I can't even believe that I've created this life for myself. And yet, you know, I read this passage in your book about if you're a woman without kids, your life is somehow incomplete. And no matter your achievements, you're always going to kind of come up short, and that you're somehow less than. I can't tell you, it just resonated so deeply, but I would love for you to talk to me about these feelings. I feel like I'm in a therapy session because they're so overwhelming, you know, it is for so many other women I've talked to.
It's almost like, so I opened the book talking about this Wikipedia game that I play.
Yes.
And I kind of was doing this, I've done this for years, sort of subconsciously, without even really realizing I was doing it. But if ever I see a woman in the public eye who's doing something kind of impressive, or that I would like to do myself, or who I just think is fucking fabulous, I'll sort of immediately go onto Wikipedia and look her up. And the first thing I want to look at is, does she have kids? Because inevitably, when I see that, yes, she has done all of this and she also has kids, it makes me feel like shit. It's kind of this emotional self-harm I'm enacting in a way, you know, because it plays into that idea that, like, no matter what else I do with my life, no matter what else I achieve, no matter how much love I have, no matter the quality of my relationships or my offerings to the world, it will never be enough. It will never be as good as it could be if I had also had kids. And I think this speaks in a way to this myth of having it all that was really perpetuated in the 1980s, following the sort of women's liberation movement, which did obviously open the doors to opportunity for so many women, not for all women, but for so many women. It became possible now to pursue a career, to pursue a creative life and have kids, to pursue financial independence, and also be a mother. And I think that, yeah, when I look at these Wikipedia women, of course, what we're seeing is the kind of the glossy public kind of facade of how that all works. Yes, I can do all of this, and I'm also a mom. But behind the scenes, there's often a shit ton of support, financial support, emotional support, support from a family upbringing. Maybe there's some privilege, unearned privilege as well. You know, it's kind of like, we don't necessarily talk about how incredibly challenging it is for the vast majority of women to have it all, to have a really full kind of life in terms of your career and your impact, and also be a mother. Of course, there are some, honestly, seemingly superhuman individuals who can just do it all and take it in their stride. And I think a big part of my process with writing this book was just accepting myself and my limitations, and knowing that I have a very sensitive, and this is stuff I'm kind of interested in speaking to you about. Like, I know that my hormonal balance is kind of very sensitive. I'm very easily overwhelmed. I don't have a high tolerance for stress. I can't have too many things packed into a day, or I'm going to be up all night with my brain whirring. I experience really intense PMS. Like, I don't sleep for 4 or 5 days around my period, which just completely knocks me off schedule. I'm in tears. I can't do anything. Like, it's just, and knowing how sensitive my system is, that married with the very real, ongoing, daily demands of being a parent, I just don't think for somebody who's built the way I'm built, it would ever be possible to do it all, regardless of how much help I had. Because even I'm really terrible at managing. I couldn't imagine managing a nanny or a housekeeper. Like that would be another full-time job that I wouldn't have the capacity for. So yeah, I think I've experienced a lot of just self-acceptance around my apparent sort of inability or lack of desire to take all of that on, just knowing how much quiet time I need, how much breathing space I need, like, yeah, just knowing what a sensitive kind of person I am, I suppose.
Yes. Very relatable yet again. I feel like we're twins. I have definitely thought about this a lot too, just about, my stress threshold and how much can I really manage? And the fact that I already feel overwhelmed by my business and the amount of work that's required to keep it going and keep building it. As you all know, I mean, you obviously do the same kind of thing. So, and even if you don't have that, like being really honest, I feel like that's the thing, right? Is that this label that we've been stuck with, whatever, selfish, whatever. Because I've seen some of your Instagram posts where people have called you that and you've talked about it openly. And I really appreciate that. But it's so frustrating because I feel like people who have chosen not to have children are the ones who have really thought this through. It's not like this is some frivolous decision and we're just like, forget that.
You just like forgot. Or you just like,
really, yeah. I'm just not interested. I'm too busy living my fabulous life. I mean, maybe there are people like that and that's great, but it's so not a thing that we just decided not to do on a whim.
Right.
Like I said, I've spent like a decade thinking about it. So, it's so involved.
It's so involved. And of course, like really diving deeply into my story around this, like, I definitely unearthed some family dysfunction, family trauma, like looking back at the kind of lives. When I look back at the sorts of lives that the women and specifically the mothers in my lineage have experienced, there's been so much oppression, so much sexism and misogyny that these women have had to endure as female-bodied individuals. And I really do believe that part of my decision not to become a mother was about disrupting that cycle and just saying, no more of that. I'm going to live an empowered, strong, autonomous life, the life that my foremothers didn't get to experience, My mum did a lot of pattern breaking, actually, in terms of her life choices. And that's been really inspiring to see her do things very differently from the rest of the other, her family. So like, that's all in there as well, which isn't necessarily always conscious, Oftentimes when there is just that niggling doubt, I'm not sure if this is for me. It's absolutely enough, of course, enough just to decide, I just don't want to do that. You don't have to do all the deep digging into the why. And for many, many years, I didn't really feel the need to do that. I just knew it's not for me.
Right.
But it was actually the result of, so my previous book was Sober Curious, and that was based off my own experience as well of removing alcohol from my life in a sort of non-traditional kind of alcoholism recovery way. And it was when I removed alcohol that I really just started to get so much clarity around the root causes of why I am the way I am, get a lot of clarity about what I actually really need on a daily basis to feel sane and healthy and well and centered and all of those things. And that sort of investigation, just shone a light on the fact that my decision not to be a parent was as much an act of sort of self-preservation as it was an act of kind of rebellion or self-gratification, right? In terms of the other things I would be able to do with my life if I didn't have kids.
Totally. I mean, I think it's a really well thought out decision. And I feel like I've had these conversations with a number of friends and they're like, I didn't think about any of this stuff that you're talking to me about right now before having my first or my second or my third. And it's just, they didn't really think about it. And I feel like this is the hugest decision you'll ever make in your whole life. At least that's how I think of it, right? You can't unmake it. You definitely can't undo this thing. Can't put that baby back in there. And yet no one's really thinking it through. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are thinking it through, but I don't get that sense. It just seems so casual to me. And that's what I'm so astounded by every time I have these conversations with parents.
Well, I think the cultural message that women are sort of built to be mothers is incredibly powerful, because it's also linked to our biological capacity to bear and birth children, right? It's kind of like we hear it all the time. Our bodies are designed to do this. But just because our bodies are designed to do it doesn't mean that our lives are designed to support us in the role of parenting and in the role of motherhood. And so I think that, again, we see a lot of people, and I'm speaking anecdotally just from conversations with friends and research I did for the book, time and again, nobody told me how hard this was going to be. And I think, and I'm always a little bit like, really? Because that's all I've ever heard.
That's all I've ever heard.
How hard it is. Maybe you just weren't listening. But I think a lot of the time I hear women become mothers and feel incredibly overwhelmed, incredibly under-supported, underserved in terms of what they actually need, and especially when it comes to their mental and emotional well-being. And I think, again, that is another sort of offshoot or side effect of this kind of blanket understanding that women are born to be mothers. Women are built to be mothers.
Right.
Yes. Okay. If you're born with a womb and you menstruate, then you have the physical capacity, in theory, to become a mother. Because also, I'm sure you know about this, but human fertility has declined massively over the past 4 or 5 decades, which, again, a lot of that's due to environmental factors, toxins in the environment, which is something that's not widely spoken about. But this is why we see so many women, even in their early 30s, having to have IVF if they want to have a baby.
Yeah. And the men
but
too.
While our bodies, biologically, we might be designed to have children, our society is not set up to support women in raising their children. We live in such isolated, sort of self-sufficient communities. There's just often not the family support, there's often not the community support that people actually really need and rely on to feel supported themselves in their child rearing. And that's before we even get into the sort of like structural or policy issues around lack of affordable healthcare, lack of affordable childcare, lack of paid parental leave. Like, none of this is available to people who are becoming mothers. And again, I think so much of that comes back to, well, women just know how to do this because biologically they're wired to do it, so they'll just figure it out.
Yep.
It's too much, and it's completely unfair, and it makes me so angry when I think about how much unnecessary suffering is the result of that attitude just being kind of left unaddressed and unquestioned, as it were.
Yes. And I often wonder, has that sort of narrative led to this romanticization of having kids? Because then women say, oh, when it happens, they're like, I didn't expect it to be this hard, like you were saying, and I'm so overwhelmed, I'm so burnt out. I mean, that's the story I hear over and over and over again. I don't know anyone who is managing this motherhood, career, business, life, with any semblance of sanity. Honestly, I maybe 1 or 2 people, but they have a significant amount of help. And so, so are we romanticizing this to a degree because of the narrative? Yeah.
Definitely. I think we romanticize and sentimentalize motherhood to a very high degree. And that's always a red flag to me, because when we sentimentalize something, it means we're willfully glossing over or turning a blind eye to what are some of the more difficult or unpalatable realities of the situation, So yeah, I think another thing I got from my parents was that they didn't ever really sugarcoat anything. I was raised really with the idea that, life is difficult and sometimes there are some really hard things and we need to look at them. And I'm incredibly, in a way, there were some things that I would have benefited to have more of a kind of like glossed over image of, I suppose. But because I grew up really fast, knowing that life was hard. But at the same time, I'm quite grateful to them, because I tend to just, like I said, I tend to get a bit uneasy when there's something that just feels like it's being sentimentalized in that way. I'm like, no, let's look at what's really going on here.
That's how I am. I know I'm constantly looking at what's really going on here. And what I'm seeing is really, to me, I'm like, okay, it's really apparent what's happening. So and here we are, like, this is why I made the decision I did. But I wanted to talk about something you said a little while back about breaking generational patterns, because I hear from women often, and I see in comments online and things like that, well, I'm doing this differently with my children. And so I'm breaking all these generational patterns. And I've thought about that a lot because I thought, oh, well, if I don't have kids, I don't have the opportunity to break all the generational patterns that I want to break. So what are your thoughts on this? Because I'm like, shoot, am I missing out?
Okay, so I have a chapter on this. It's called Origin Stories. And that chapter really looks at what is actually, a reality for us when we don't have children. Something is ending with me. This specific branch of my family tree ends with me, right? And that can feel sort of quite sad and quite lonely and kind of, we don't like things to end in our culture
final.
either.
I know. So
final, right?
Oh, I know.
We like things to keep growing and keep on surviving. We don't like endings necessarily. We don't like quitting. But I sort of reframe it in that chapter as what if it means that on some level, my soul, or part of me, for people who are less spiritually minded, has decided that something in my lineage is going to end with me. I'm going to put a stop to it by not getting another generation involved to keep playing out that same cycle of dysfunction. So I think even what you shared about seeing parents talking about breaking the patterns, I think that we do have a general awareness in our culture now as well, that patterns, we learn stuff, right? We learn beliefs, we learn behaviors that kind of live in us and then kind of get subconsciously acted out in our lives. We learn them, we're imprinted with them from our families of origin. I think people are becoming more sort of cognizant of that. And I think, yeah, we see it in our families. Like I've spoken to people who are like, wow, yeah, I can see how I'm totally behaving like dad was, or this part of me comes out of my character when I'm around my kids and I didn't even know it was there. And it's like, yeah, the way we were parented informs how we parent. It's literally kind of imprinted in us. And so I think it's very, very hard once you have a child not to continue to repeat those patterns. But I think what you're talking about is this sort of conscious parenting movement, where people who are more conscious, maybe they've done their own sort of therapy, personal development work, they're aware that this is going to happen and that it's actually on them to change their behaviors, change the way they're talking to their children, change the belief systems that they're maybe without even realizing, encoding in their kids, and to be really conscious about that as parents. So I think that there are two ways of kind of enacting this pattern breaking. One is to, as a parent, be a conscious parent and change the patterns with your own children, which I think I'm the beneficiary of that. I think my mom did a lot of that, actually. And there's not having a child. And what this probably means is there's going to be stuff for you to do in your own self around breaking those patterns in your own behaviors, your own actions, your own limiting beliefs, self-sabotaging behaviors, etc., etc. And if you're really brave, it's stuff you can turn backwards and do with your parents as an adult and invite your parents into with you. Oh, and I say brave because parents, as I have learned, don't necessarily like hearing from their kids, hey, this is how you are with me. Did you ever realize that? There's this kind of like unspoken rule that parents get to do the telling and that kids don't get to speak back, which again is kind of an inherited sort of like cultural mode of behavior, right? So yeah, and I share this because sharing the manuscript for the book with my mom and my dad, but with my mom in particular, did lead to some very challenging and revealing and unsentimental conversations about the realities of my childhood and her parenting. And ultimately, it's brought us to a place where we're so much closer. Like we've created a bond. It wasn't even that we had to repair a bond. The bond really wasn't there before. We've created, or we're beginning to create a bond that I've never experienced with her before, which just feels so healing. And again, from a more sort of mystical, sort of spiritual level, I suppose, I can visualize that or have a sense of that as being a healing that will be felt going backwards in my lineage, which to me is profound. I may not see the physical result of that in my child, having a very different life or feeling differently about themselves or their relationships, their self-esteem, their creativity, whatever. But I can feel it in my own life, and I can feel it in my relationship with my mother. And that to me is enough.
I mean, that's huge. And what you said about just choosing not to have a child is healing of generational trauma in so many ways. Mm-hmm. So I just really appreciate that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't always need, I mean, there are some, so I talk about this, a modality called family constellations therapy,
yes.
which kind of says that, every family has its traumas, its wounds, its dysfunctions, and that each new child that's born into that family is another opportunity for that stuff to be worked out. And so when you don't have a child, I do think the responsibility is on us to a degree as childless and child-free people to look at, well, what work can I do on myself in my own life, and how might I pay that forward to my wider community in other ways?
Yes, I mean, it's so beautifully put. I want to switch gears a little bit, because I've been thinking about the fact that, for me, I'm just a very practical person. And one of my thought processes around having kids is the world's population. It's weighed on me. And I'm sure there's some people who are going to listen to this and be annoyed by what I'm about to say, but this is my personal perspective. But I've never really been able to get past the fact that our population has been surging for many decades. You actually put up a post recently on Instagram, I think, about this, and it so resonated. And what I read in your book as well was just so interesting to me. And so, yes, adding another human to the mix seems, to me personally, not like a good idea. And again, this isn't a judgment, obviously, from me to anyone else. It's just my own personal belief about bringing a child into the world. And I would love for you to talk about this, talk about the different paths women take and the diverse reasons behind why women are choosing not to have children. I know this is a big one, because I know that there are people who are not having kids for climate change reasons, population reasons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just to speak to the population piece, there are two sort of schools of thought around this, and the surging is a good way to put it, the surging population. We've actually witnessed in the past 200 years absolutely unprecedented growth in terms of the population. Yeah. And one of the other things that prompted me to write the book is that the population is plateauing. And in fact, the individual birth rate, the number of women that individual children have, is plummeting in every single country around the world. Now, so on the environmentalist side, this is seen as a good thing. Environmentalists will say that one of the most important things we can do in terms of preserving the environment for future generations is to reduce the size of the population, because we're consuming resources at an absolutely unsustainable rate. However, economists will say that the plunging birth rate is a really bad thing, because we're going to have far too many old people, and we're not going to have the thriving youthful economy to support the needs of people who have aged out of the workforce. So we don't really have enough time to go deeply into that second one.
Yep, that's a whole other interview, I think.
But what I will speak to is this idea of there being too many people. In the book, I present the idea that actually telling people to have fewer children and sort of creating a panic around there are too many people isn't really where we need to be focusing our efforts. We need to be focusing our efforts on pressuring governments and industry into creating new sources of renewable energy, and really as swiftly as possible reducing carbon emissions, which is, it feels painfully slow that progress is being made in that area. Progress is being made in that area, but nowhere near fast enough. The bottom line being, it's not necessarily that too many people is the problem. What's the problem is the way that we consume and use energy and other resources on the planet. And human ingenuity, you would think, could be channeled into ways to kind of better and more sustainably, power our world, right? But it's a hugely complex issue. And I think as well, just, there's so much to be said. A lot of people are just kind of, well, the world is so divisive, the world is so divided, the world is so full of hate, there's so much war still, human beings just have kind of we haven't done a great job. Why would I want to bring a child into a world where there's so much hate, where I'm going to have to worry as a parent about them going to preschool and maybe getting shot in a shoot. Like, it's just,
I know we face,
it just make me really mad and really
challenges.
sad.
I know the US seems to have
really
unique
intense challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, there are challenges all over the world, you know.
Oh, for sure. I think when you said
xenophobia,
the shooting piece, yeah, like the part about like
right.
your kid going to school, that's a big one. Yeah.
That's a specific US thing. And I definitely have heard, particularly among younger generations, people voicing that as a reason that they're not feeling that great about having kids. You know, if I know my kid's not going to be safe, he leaves the house in the morning, maybe because he has brown skin, and that adds another layer of risk. You know, why would I bring a child into a world where, while we proclaim to be pro-life, we're still making it easier than ever for people to buy and walk around with concealed weapons? You know, it's just, there's so much hypocrisy around the value of life and the things that we invest in as a society. Why do we still invest so much in military and so little in healthcare, when healthcare is what people need, you know? So I don't want to get too political here, but these bigger issues are definitely some of the reasons that are influencing people's decisions about whether or not to have children, let alone, and we haven't even touched on, you know, inflation, just the cost of living, and how hard it is for people to get by on even quite a decent salary. You know, the thought of bringing another human into your household who you're then going to have to clothe, feed, educate. You know, becoming a single mother increases a woman's risk of falling into poverty by 400%. So that's a very real consideration, especially for people who might have been raised, you know, in a single parent home, or where they're the children of divorce. Like, sorry.
I appreciate it.
We're getting a bit dark now, but obviously I do unpack all of this in depth in the book, whilst also talking about all of the very, you know, empowering and positive aspects of living a child-free life, you know?
Yes. I know there's so much to talk about here. I feel like everyone should just read your book, everybody, if you want to learn more about all of this. Do you have any numbers on the falling birth rate? I know you said, is this happening in every country? You said, I just assumed that it was more developed countries that the birth rates are falling, and that's where the economists were all worried. Whereas in developing countries, those birth rates are either stable or they're actually increasing.
Birth rates are decreasing dramatically everywhere. All countries around the world. Birth rates are the lowest in the most developed countries, which I think is very interesting. And we do see the more access women have to financial freedom, financial independence, let's say, which means more access to education and employment opportunities women have, the fewer children they have. So you could sort of say that the more equal a society, the less patriarchal and the less oppressive to women, the lower the birth rate is going to be. So that, which I think is very telling, right? In terms of, well, we want the birth rate to be higher. We need women to be having more children. Well, the only way to do that is to oppress women and take away opportunities from women. Because even in countries, you know, countries in Africa and the Middle East, these are countries where there is often still a very patriarchal sort of society, where birth rates have typically been very, very high. But even in these countries, the birth rate is dropping the more access women have to any kind of autonomy over their lives. And the more, the more financial independence people have in general, the less children they will have.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. Oh my gosh, I feel like we need a part 2, but I was thinking about the term pronatalism. The first time I heard that word was actually only a few years ago. It was a conversation with a friend of mine who is German, but lives here in the US. She has 3 kids. She talks about how when she's in Germany, she feels very judged because she has 3 kids, because they're not a pronatalist society. Whereas in the US, she doesn't feel this at all. Can we talk about this, like elaborate on pronatalism, like what it is, the deeper implications of this cultural, social belief system?
Yeah, sure. So I had heard that term, and I had heard it applied to, you know, policies which are designed to sort of encourage people to have more children. So this could be applied to things such as tax breaks for parents, tax credits for parents, paid leave, etc., etc. These could be termed pronatalist policies. because ultimately they're about encouraging people to have more children. But pronatalism, in terms of the child-free conversation, came up in some of the early interviews that I was doing for the book. And it was defined to me then as an ideology, which is one of the cornerstones of patriarchy, which essentially says that parents, and therefore married people, because we're not having any kids out of wedlock, parents are more valid than non-parents, and married people are more valid than single people. And as soon as I heard it defined that way, I could almost just feel it in my body. I could just feel that. And I think anybody who hasn't fulfilled either the parenthood prescription and or the marriage prescription can feel that. There's these subtle sort of, and sometimes not so subtle, prejudice or attitudinal kind of difference towards your life choices or life circumstances and the choices and circumstances of those who have followed that sort of that path, right? So yeah, pronatalist society, any pronatalist society will actively encourage, if not coerce, people, and when I say people, I mean women, into having more children. So for example, the Roe being overturned was a pronatalist move in the terms of, the US government. So that's pronatalism. And again, it's one of those things, once you hear it, once you're aware of it, you can sort of start to see it everywhere. It's completely in going back to the whole piece about like comparing myself and my achievements to women who have kids and always feeling like it's not enough, I'm not as good at, or I haven't done enough. My life's not as worthwhile ultimately as those of women who have had children. That's pronatalism at work in me,
Oh, I know, girl, I know.
Yeah, you feel it too.
Yeah. Oh, are you kidding? Of course. And it was just an interesting conversation because I didn't realize that she felt those feelings when going back to her home country and didn't feel those feelings here.
But you
can't
interesting
win though.
But what is interesting is that Germany has some of the best social supports for parents.
Right.
My brother lives in Germany and they receive monthly check from the government. I think in some instances you'll even, there's a very good paid leave. Some instances people even receive cash bonus just for having a child. And these kinds of policies have been implemented in many European countries where there is concern around the very low birth rate,
Right. Yeah. No, that's what I thought was so weird.
Rewarding people for having children, as in like cash bonuses, tax credits, etc. Rewarding people for having children is different from what might be termed pro-family policies. Like a pro-family policy would be free healthcare for everybody.
Right.
Because that would ensure that the grandparents are also looked after and that caregiving doesn't fall on the shoulders of the younger generations, right? Pro-family policies would also ensure a really substantial living wage, that potentially a family of 3 or more people could live on one wage. Higher wages would be across the board, particularly for sort of like blue collar jobs, would be a pro-family policy. But we don't see these kinds of policies being put in place.
Yeah, no, not at all.
We just see policies that are about get women to have as many children as possible. Once they're here, then it's on those women to figure out how to look after them. We as a society are not going to take responsibility for, caring for our people.
100%. It drives me absolutely bananas. It's enraging.
It's crazy making. Yeah, it really is.
I cannot agree with you more. And, what in my conversation with her, it just made me think like, wow, so she's feeling the way she's feeling and she's fulfilled, her duty as a woman, right? She's got these 3 lovely kids and I feel the way I feel. And so it is this really strange situation where women don't really feel like they're winning at all. Like, because you can't really do anything right. Like you're judged regardless of what you do is what it feels like to me.
Exactly. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Yeah.
100%.
And so I think that, again, like there's this term, it's quite an extreme term, but it's used a bit like birth strike. And I touch on it in the book. Yeah. But this idea that actually, whether it's conscious or not, this withdrawal from reproductive duties is in some ways we need to disrupt the status quo and support women in their mothering, support women in choosing the lives that they want to choose for themselves. we need to really think about what true gender equality is, you know. I think the feminist movement has so far to go. Sadly, and again, like I've just been coming out of my PMS phase, and I've just been feeling exhausted by how, and I say this as like, you know, a straight married white woman who has so many privileges at my disposal, but how exhausting it is to be a woman sometimes, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. Not least because of this, what you're talking about, like no matter what you do, what you choose, who you are, what you contribute, it's either never enough, or it's not the right thing, or it's just, it's just
so true.
And the level of some of, I haven't necessarily received a ton of it on my social media, but when I look on other accounts, like Joe Rogan posted something about the concept of this birthright movement the other day, and the level of misogyny and hate in the comments was so extreme. And it just made me, again, it was just a window into, no matter how far we think we've come in terms of female empowerment, there are so many people who are just not on board with that.
100% not on board.
Do not want that, who would love for things to go back to how they were.
Yeah. It's exhausting. You're so right. I know.
It's exhausting.
I know. I'm on day 1 of my period, and I'm already exhausted. And so when I was listening to you talk about the hormone piece and the stress resilience and all of these things, I'm like, I already, like I said, feel so overwhelmed by what we've got going on in our lives. Like, I can't imagine adding the responsibility of a child or multiple children on. And so this brings me to the real taboo topic of regret. And I think about, and I've read multiple articles about this, and this was also something that, I've really contemplated over the years. And I remember a scene in that show House of Cards with Kevin Spacey and Claire, his wife, Claire Underwood.
Yes.
Right. So like she's in this scene. I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was the VP's wife. It might've been. And she asks her if she regretted not having kids. And her reply was so direct. And she was like, "Do you regret having them?" And I had never seen a woman on TV so bluntly say something like that. And I've never seen anybody, right. Yeah. Never seen anybody ask that question in real life either. Let's talk about regret, because nobody can talk about this. Like you're like a terrible human being, definitely a terrible mother if you even talk about this. And every time I have these conversations where some women will get to the point where they almost say it, but then they say, "But I love my kids so much." I mean, as if they, so they can't, I don't know. It's like they have to qualify the conversation with, "But my kids are like a blessing and they're the best thing in the whole world." And I'm like, it's okay. You can feel how you feel. I'm not like going to character assassinate you for the feelings that you have.
But again, like, it is almost the ultimate taboo, because women are built to be mothers, right? To become a mother and to not feel completely fulfilled in it, to let alone regret it, is just disallowed. This is disallowed. So there's a fantastic book called Regretting Motherhood, which I quote from extensively in Women Without Kids, by an Israeli sociologist called Orna Donath. And she interviews in that book about 25 women who agreed to talk about how much they regretted having had kids, and would absolutely outright say, "If I had my time again, I wouldn't do it." And it's just such interesting reading, because it's such a taboo. And it's not that it was validating for me, but it presents the other path, the other side of the coin, which we never talk about, which again, I just find such a relief, to hear the truth. Because as any woman who has even expressed doubts about whether she wants to become a mother, will have heard, but what if you regret it? There will come there will come a time when you regret it, And I suppose my response to this is sort of netting out around here. I feel like there is no guarantee of the future. There's no guarantee of what will happen, what we'll experience, how our elder years will be, whether we'll even make it that far. We have no way of knowing. So rather than making decisions that go against what we need and who we are right now, rushing into things because we're worried that we might regret something, however many decades down the line, I'm really more concerned with, what will I regret not doing today? Like, what will I regret next week if I don't do it this week? How can I really make sure I'm making choices right now in my life today that are in service of me, that are giving me what I need, that are, making whatever contribution I can, that are repairing rifts and ruptures within my relationships? How can I really focus on giving it my all right now with the things that are right in front of me, rather than focusing on where am I going to be in 20 years time and how is it going to feel if I don't have children? It's been incredibly comforting, I suppose, to speak to, for my research, many older women without kids, ranging from people in their late 50s through to sort of early 80s. And not once did I hear a woman, but if it had been a choice, whether it was an affirmative no way, or if it had been more of a kind of like, oh, after careful consideration, it's not for me. Not once did I hear anyone say, I really regret not having a child. So
wow. Not once.
Yeah, not once. Not once, which I think is amazing. And again, I have a whole chapter where I talk about this, which centers a lot around acceptance. And I think the more we can just accept that no one of us is ever going to have it all. No one of us is going to have all of our dreams come true. The best we can ever do is make the best of what we've got, right? And so there's a lot around just accepting this is my life. What is in my power to change? What do I have no control over? And again, I do think, technologies like IVF have helped a lot of people, even people who have undergone multiple rounds of IVF and not been able to have children. I think there's a sense there of, well, I gave it the best shot I could. And there's definitely going to be, of course, grief around not being able to have children. I'm probably possibly working with feelings of having failed, or again, there being something defective or wrong with me. But I think even in those circumstances now, it's possible to say, well, I did everything I could, and here I am. Yeah.
I think we should close out on that, because that was so well said. And I think it's going to just give so many women comfort and just wanting to really like put closure to this, if this is how, if this is a decision that they've been grappling with. Thank you so much. This was really incredible. And I'm always so appreciative of my guests who come on and just share from the heart. And I really feel like you did that. So thank you so much, Ruby.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really happy that you reached out. It's good to know you.
Yes, absolutely. And so can you just share with everyone where they can find you and find your amazing book, Women Without Kids?
So hopefully Women Without Kids will be available wherever you can get your books. If you can go to bookshop.org or get it from an indie, that would be awesome. There's also an audiobook, which is read by me, where I think they captured me breaking down in tears a few times, because I thought they were going to edit it out, but like a few people have been like, oh my God, when you read this part and you started crying, I was just like, oh. So
they didn't edit it out. That's amazing.
I think they like to bring the emotion. Anyway, well, so there's an audiobook. And I guess I take long breaks from Instagram, but I've been quite active there recently at Ruby Warrington, because I am really passionate about this subject, and it just is something I'm kind of enjoying being in the conversation about. So I'm at Ruby Warrington. And this is a bit of an experiment. I also just created a Women Without Kids private Facebook group. Oh, nice. For people to connect, find each other, share some of their experiences. So that's very, very new. But if people are on Facebook, they can look for Women Without Kids Sisterhood. It's a group I created there.
Amazing. Thank you. This was excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at nicolejardim.com/quiz.